37. Baby found mother bear. Teaching other animals. Emergency response. What happened next was incredible. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, thick with pine and oak trees that had stood for centuries. Ethan Marshall adjusted the camera strap around his neck, his boots crunching softly against the carpet of fallen leaves. He had driven 6 hours from the city, seeking the kind of silence that only deep wilderness could provide. The morning mist still clung to the ground, creating ghostly patterns between the tree trunks. He had come here to photograph the untouched beauty of nature, but what he was about to witness would change everything he thought he knew about the wild. The air carried a strange quality that morning, something Ethan couldn't quite place. It wasn't just the usual forest sounds, the distant call of birds, the rustling of leaves in the gentle breeze. There was something else, something that made the hair on the back of his neck stand up, not from fear, but from a peculiar sense of anticipation. He moved deeper into the forest, following a narrow deer trail that wound between massive boulders covered in emerald moss. The further he walked, the more pronounced that strange feeling became, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. After nearly an hour of hiking, Ethan came upon a clearing that made him stop in his tracks. The space was roughly circular, perhaps 50 feet across, surrounded by towering evergreens that formed a natural amphitheater. But it wasn't the clearing itself that caught his attention. It was what was happening within it. In the center stood a massive brown bear, a mother by the looks of her, with a small cub playing near her feet. This alone wouldn't have been unusual, except for the fact that arranged in a semicircle around her were animals that should never have been there together. 3 white-tailed deer sat on their haunches, their usually alert ears relaxed. A family of raccoons huddled nearby, their masked faces turned attentively toward the bear. Several squirrels had descended from the trees and sat in neat rows, their bushy tails still for once. Even more remarkably, a red fox had positioned itself at the edge of the group, showing no signs of its typical predatory behavior. Ethan's hands trembled as he slowly, carefully raised his camera. Through the viewfinder, the scene looked even more surreal. The mother bear was moving with deliberate, measured gestures, raising one paw, then the other, turning her head in specific directions. It looked for all the world like she was teaching them something. The other animals watched intently, some of them mimicking her movements in their own way. The deer would lower their heads when the bear lowered hers. The raccoons would raise their small hands when she lifted her massive paws. Even the birds, perched in the lower branches, seemed to be following along, tilting their heads in synchronization with her movements. The bear cub, meanwhile, was trying to copy his mother but kept getting distracted. He would start to follow her movements, then suddenly tumble over his own feet or become fascinated by a butterfly. Each time this happened, the mother bear would gently nudge him back into position with her nose, and Ethan could swear he saw patience in her eyes, the same kind of patience he had seen in human mothers teaching their children. The cub would right himself, look up at his mother with what could only be described as determination, and try again. Sometimes he got it right, and when he did, the mother bear would make a soft, approving sound that rumbled deep in her chest. What struck Ethan most was the complete absence of fear among the prey animals. The deer, who should have fled at the first scent of bear, remained calm and focused. The squirrels, typically the most skittish of forest creatures, stayed perfectly still except when following the bear's movements. Even more extraordinary was when the fox accidentally brushed against one of the rabbits that had joined the group. Neither animal flinched or showed any sign of alarm. They simply readjusted their positions and continued watching the bear's demonstration. As Ethan watched, the mother bear began a new sequence of movements. She stood on her hind legs, reaching up toward the sky with both paws, then dropped back down and pressed her nose to the ground. She repeated this 3 times, each movement flowing smoothly into the next. The other animals attempted to follow suit. The deer rising slightly on their hind legs, the raccoons stretching up as tall as they could manage, even the birds extending their wings upward before folding them back. The cub tried especially hard this time, managing to stand for a few seconds before toppling backward with a soft thump that would have been comical if the whole situation wasn't so mysteriously profound. The lesson, if that's what it was, continued for several more minutes. The bear demonstrated different positions and movements, sometimes slow and graceful, sometimes quick and precise. She would pause after each sequence, looking around at her unusual students as if checking their understanding. When one of the deer struggled with a particular movement, the bear actually moved closer to it, demonstrating the action again more slowly. The deer watched carefully and tried again, this time managing to complete the movement more accurately. The bear made that same approving rumble, and incredibly, the deer's tail flicked in what looked like satisfaction. Ethan realized he had been holding his breath and let it out slowly, afraid that even the smallest sound might disturb this impossible gathering. His mind raced with questions. How long had this been happening? Was this some kind of regular occurrence that humans had simply never witnessed? The rational part of his brain, the part that had studied biology in college, told him this was impossible. Different species didn't gather like this, didn't learn from each other in such an organized way. Predators and prey didn't set aside their natural roles to participate in what looked like a classroom setting. Yet here it was, happening right before his eyes. The mother bear moved into what appeared to be the final demonstration of this particular session. She walked to a specific tree at the edge of the clearing, an ancient oak with a hollow at its base. She carefully inserted her paw into the hollow, withdrew it, then repeated the action with her other paw. She then moved to another tree, this one with a hollow higher up, and stood to reach it, again demonstrating the careful insertion and withdrawal of her paw. The other animals watched with what Ethan could only describe as intense concentration. Even the cub had stopped his playful distractions and was watching his mother with wide, attentive eyes. After the bear completed her demonstration at several different trees, she returned to the center of the clearing and sat down. The other animals remained still for a moment, as if waiting for permission, then began to disperse, but not in the chaotic scatter Ethan would have expected. They moved slowly, deliberately, some of them actually approaching the trees the bear had shown them. A brave squirrel scampered up to one of the hollows and carefully examined it with its tiny paws. One of the deer approached the ancient oak and lowered its head to inspect the base where the hollow was located. The fox was perhaps the most interesting to watch. It approached one of the marked trees with an almost scientific curiosity, circling it completely before sitting down in front of the hollow and studying it intently. It made no move to investigate with its paws like the bear had demonstrated, but seemed to be memorizing every detail of the location and appearance of the hiding spot. After a few moments, it moved to the next tree the bear had shown them, repeating its careful observation. Meanwhile, the bear cub had wandered over to a group of young rabbits that had been watching from the edge of the clearing. Instead of the fearful scatter that should have occurred, the rabbits actually allowed the cub to approach. He sniffed at them curiously, and one particularly bold rabbit actually sniffed back. The cub made a playful batting motion with his paw, not aggressive, just playful, and the rabbit hopped backward, then forward again, as if understanding this was a game. The mother bear watched this interaction with what Ethan could only interpret as approval, making no move to call her cub away or to take advantage of the easy prey. The entire scene had an almost dreamlike quality to it. The morning sun had risen higher now, sending shafts of golden light through the canopy that illuminated the clearing in patches. Dust motes danced in these beams of light, and the whole forest seemed to pulse with a quiet, ancient wisdom that Ethan had never noticed before. He had taken dozens of photos, but he found himself lowering his camera more and more often, simply watching with his own eyes, trying to commit every detail to memory. As he observed, Ethan noticed other subtle details that defied explanation. The animals seemed to be communicating with each other through looks and small gestures. A deer would make eye contact with a raccoon and tilt its head slightly, and the raccoon would respond with a small chittering sound that seemed almost conversational. The birds would occasionally swoop down from their perches, land near other animals, chirp something that sounded deliberate and specific, then return to their branches. It wasn't random animal behavior. It had structure, purpose, meaning that Ethan couldn't decode but could definitely sense. The mother bear stood up again, and all the animals immediately turned their attention back to her. She made a series of soft sounds, not quite growls, not quite purrs, something in between that Ethan had never heard a bear make before. The other animals responded with their own sounds. The deer with soft snorts, the raccoons with gentle churring, the birds with melodic chirps that seemed to harmonize with each other. It was like a strange forest orchestra, each species contributing its own note to create something that wasn't quite music, but wasn't quite random noise either. Then something even more extraordinary happened. The bear walked to the center of the clearing and began to draw in the dirt with her massive paw. She wasn't just scratching randomly, she was making deliberate marks, creating a pattern. The other animals gathered closer to watch, forming a tight circle around her. Even from his hidden position, Ethan could see the concentration on the bear's face as she worked. The pattern she was creating looked almost like a map, with lines radiating out from a central point, little circles at various positions along these lines. The cub tried to help, adding his own small scratches to the dirt, but his mother gently moved him aside with her nose. This wasn't playtime. This was something important. When she finished, she sat back and looked at the assembled animals, then pointed with her paw to different parts of the pattern. First to one of the circles, then to a deer, then to another circle, gesturing toward the fox, another circle indicating the raccoons. She was assigning positions, Ethan realized with a start. She was organizing them for something. The animals seemed to understand perfectly. They studied the pattern, some of them moving around it to see it from different angles. The fox actually traced one of the lines with its paw, following it from the center to one of the outer circles. The deer lowered their heads close to the ground, their breath stirring the loose dirt slightly as they examined the bear's creation. Even the birds flew down to perch on the ground, hopping around the edge of the pattern with obvious interest. After several minutes of study, the animals began to move with purpose. They spread out through the clearing and into the surrounding forest, but not randomly. They were taking specific positions that seemed to correspond to the marks the bear had made in the dirt. Some climbed trees, others positioned themselves behind certain rocks or fallen logs. The bear and her cub remained in the center, the mother turning slowly in a circle as if checking that everyone was in their assigned position. Ethan's heart was pounding now. Whatever was happening, it was clearly building toward something. The organized positioning, the careful preparation, the obvious communication between species. It all pointed to some kind of coordinated response or action. But response to what? There was no sign of danger, no approaching storm, no forest fire smoke on the horizon. The forest was as peaceful as it had been when he arrived, perhaps even more so. Then he heard it, or rather, felt it. a low vibration that seemed to come from the earth itself. So deep it was more sensation than sound. The animals had clearly been expecting this. They didn't panic or flee. Instead, they seemed to settle more firmly into their positions, their attention focused and alert. The mother bear stood up on her hind legs, her cub mimicking her as best he could, both of them facing the same direction, toward the deeper forest where the vibration seemed to originate. The vibration grew stronger, not threatening but insistent, like the earth's own heartbeat had suddenly become audible. Ethan found himself gripping a tree trunk for support, not from fear, but from the sheer strangeness of the sensation. It was as if the entire forest was humming at a frequency just below human hearing, a sound felt in the bones rather than heard with the ears. The animals remained perfectly still in their positions, waiting. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the vibration changed. It became more musical, almost like a deep, resonant chord played on an instrument too large to imagine. The animals responded immediately. The birds began to sing. Not their usual chaotic dawn chorus, but something synchronized and haunting. The deer made low, melodious sounds Ethan had never heard from them before. The raccoons and squirrels added their own voices, creating layers of sound that somehow harmonized with the deep earth. Hum. The mother bear and her cub remained silent, but began to move in a slow, graceful dance. They swayed together, the mother's movements flowing and purposeful, the cub following along with clumsy but determined effort. It was beautiful and strange and somehow sacred, like witnessing an ancient ritual that predated human civilization. Ethan found tears streaming down his face, though he couldn't have said why. There was something so profound about this moment, this revelation that the natural world contained mysteries far deeper than humans had ever suspected. The performance, for lack of a better word, continued for several minutes. The sound ebbed and flowed like waves, sometimes growing so intense that Ethan could feel it vibrating in his chest, other times fading to barely a whisper. The animals adjusted their own sounds accordingly, maintaining perfect harmony with the earth's song. The bear's dance became more elaborate, incorporating the movements she had been teaching earlier, and Ethan finally understood. This hadn't been random instruction. She had been preparing them for this specific moment, teaching them their parts in some grand natural symphony. As he watched, other animals began to arrive at the clearing. A family of deer emerged from the forest, taking predetermined positions without any visible instruction. A pair of wolves appeared at the forest edge, and instead of causing panic, they simply sat and added their howls to the chorus at perfectly timed intervals. More birds arrived, filling the trees until every branch seemed occupied. The clearing was becoming crowded, but every animal seemed to know exactly where it belonged. The cub, overwhelmed by all the activity, had pressed close to his mother's side. She paused in her dance to nuzzle him reassuringly, then lifted him gently with one paw, positioning him on her back. From this elevated position he could see everything, and his small eyes were wide with wonder. He made soft, excited sounds that somehow managed to blend perfectly with the ongoing symphony, as if even his baby enthusiasm was part of the plan. Ethan realized his camera had been hanging unused around his neck for the past several minutes. He raised it again, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely focus. This wasn't just animal behavior. This was evidence of something extraordinary, something that would revolutionize our understanding of animal intelligence and communication. But even as he thought this, he wondered if anyone would believe him. The photos alone wouldn't convey the profound sense of purpose and coordination he was witnessing. The earth sound began to change again, growing lighter somehow, less deep vibration and more musical tone. The animals adjusted immediately, their voices shifting to match. The bear's dance became quicker, more joyful, and her cub chirped with delight from his position on her back. The other animals began to move as well, not chaotically but in patterns, circles within circles, prey and predator moving in harmony without fear or aggression. Then Ethan noticed something else. The trees themselves seemed to be responding. Their leaves rustled in patterns that didn't match the wind, creating a whispering accompaniment to the animal sounds. The moss on the rocks appeared to pulse with a faint luminescence, so subtle he might have imagined it if he hadn't been watching so carefully. Even the small stream that ran along one edge of the clearing seemed to babble in rhythm with everything else, its water catching the light in unusual ways. The fox had moved closer to the center now, actually brushing against one of the deer as it passed. The deer didn't flinch, just shifted slightly to give the fox room. A rabbit hopped directly between the wolves' front paws, and they simply watched it pass with calm, intelligent eyes. The normal rules of the forest had been completely suspended, replaced by something Ethan had no framework to understand. The mother bear began making specific gestures again, and the animals responded by changing their formation. They created concentric circles around her and the cub, prey and predator alternating in a pattern that should have been impossible. A squirrel actually climbed onto a wolf's back to gain height, and the wolf allowed it without reaction. Birds landed on the deer's antlers, creating living decorations that swayed with the deer's movements. The sound was reaching some kind of crescendo now. Ethan could feel it building, like the moment before thunder after lightning, that pregnant pause where the air itself seems to hold its breath. The animals sensed it too. Their movements became more precise, more synchronized. Even the cub had stopped his wiggling and was perfectly still on his mother's back, his small body tense with anticipation. Then, in a moment that Ethan would replay in his mind for the rest of his life, everything stopped. The sound cut off abruptly. The animals froze in place. Even the wind seemed to pause. For 3 heartbeats, maybe 4, the entire forest was locked in perfect, absolute stillness. Ethan found he couldn't even breathe, caught up in the moment's power. When the stillness broke, it wasn't with sound, but with light. The moss that Ethan had thought might be glowing earlier suddenly blazed with soft green luminescence. Not bright enough to hurt the eyes, but clearly visible even in the morning sunlight. The light spread from the moss to the trees themselves, following veins in the bark that Ethan had never noticed before, creating glowing patterns that looked almost like writing in some unknown language. The animals remained still, but their eyes reflected the light in unusual ways, making them seem lit from within. The mother bear slowly lowered herself to all fours, her cub sliding gently to the ground. She touched her nose to one of the glowing patches of moss, and the light pulsed brighter for a moment. Then she looked directly at where Ethan was hiding. He froze, certain he had been discovered, but the bear simply looked at him for a long moment, her eyes ancient and knowing, then turned away. She made a soft sound, and the other animals began to disperse. But again, it wasn't the chaos of animals fleeing. They moved slowly, deliberately, many of them pausing to touch the glowing moss with paw or nose or wing before departing. The wolves padded away into the forest. The deer bounded gracefully in the opposite direction. The smaller animals scattered to their various homes. The cub followed his mother to one of the glowing trees. She showed him how to place his small paw on the luminescent bark, and when he did, the light pulsed gently, as if responding to his touch. He made a sound of pure wonder that was so human-like it made Ethan's chest ache. The mother bear nuzzled her cub affectionately, then led him toward the deeper forest. Just before they disappeared into the trees, she looked back one more time at Ethan's hiding spot, and he could swear she nodded slightly. Within minutes, the clearing was empty except for Ethan and the gradually fading glow. He stood up slowly, his legs stiff from remaining still for so long, and walked into the clearing. The pattern the bear had drawn was still visible in the dirt, though already beginning to blur from the movement of many feet. He knelt beside it, tracing one of the lines with his finger, trying to memorize every detail. The moss was still glowing faintly, and when he touched it, he felt a slight tingling sensation, not unpleasant but definitely unusual. He took photo after photo, knowing they would never capture what he had really witnessed, but needing some kind of evidence that this had really happened. The light continued to fade as he worked, and within 10 minutes the moss looked completely normal again, giving no hint of its hidden properties. Ethan spent another hour in the clearing, examining every detail, taking measurements, making sketches in his notebook. He found traces of the animal's presence, footprints of different species overlapping in ways that would baffle any tracker, fur from predator and prey caught on the same branch, marks in the dirt where they had sat together in impossible harmony. But he knew that without witnessing it himself, no one would believe what these signs meant. As he finally prepared to leave, Ethan noticed something else. The forest felt different now. Not in any way he could define, but there was a sense of connection, of purpose, that hadn't been there before. Or maybe it had always been there, and he simply hadn't known how to perceive it. The birds singing in the trees seemed less random, more like they were passing messages. The rustling of leaves sounded almost like whispers. Even his own footsteps seemed to fall into a rhythm that matched some greater pattern he could sense but not understand. He paused at the edge of the clearing for one last look. In the afternoon sunlight, it looked like any other forest clearing. Peaceful, natural, unremarkable. But Ethan knew better now. He had witnessed something extraordinary, something that suggested the natural world was far more complex and interconnected than humans had ever imagined. The mother bear teaching other animals, the impossible cooperation between species, the earth itself singing, the glowing moss. It all pointed to mysteries that might take lifetimes to understand. As he made his way back through the forest, Ethan found himself moving more carefully, more respectfully. Every tree might harbor secrets. Every animal might be more than it seemed. He thought about the bear cub, trying so hard to learn from his mother, and wondered what other lessons were being taught in the hidden corners of the wilderness. He thought about the way the animals had looked at each other, the obvious communication happening at levels humans couldn't perceive. By the time he reached his car, the sun was beginning to set. He sat in the driver's seat for a long moment, looking back at the forest. Part of him wanted to go back, to camp there and see if the phenomenon would repeat. But somehow he knew this had been a special gift, a glimpse into something sacred that wasn't meant for constant human observation. He had been allowed to witness it once, and that would have to be enough. As he drove away, Ethan's mind was already racing with questions. What had triggered the gathering? How did the animals know when and where to meet? What was the purpose of the glowing moss, and how did it relate to the sound that seemed to come from the earth itself? He knew he would spend years, maybe the rest of his life, trying to understand what he had seen. But even without answers, he felt changed by the experience, more connected to the natural world than ever before. The next morning, Ethan woke in his apartment in the city with the events of the previous day feeling like a dream. But the photos on his camera were real, even if they couldn't fully capture what had happened. He spent hours reviewing them, each image bringing back the profound sense of wonder he had felt. The bear and her cub, the impossible gathering of animals, the glowing forest. It had all been real, He thought about publishing the photos, writing an article about what he had witnessed. But every time he tried to put it into words, they seemed inadequate. How could he explain the intelligence in the mother bear's eyes? How could he describe the sensation of the earth singing? How could he make anyone understand the perfect cooperation between predator and prey without sounding like he had lost his mind? The experience felt too sacred to reduce to mere words and images. Days passed, then weeks. Ethan found himself returning to the forest whenever he could, always hoping to witness the gathering again. He found the clearing easily enough, and sometimes he would see the mother bear and her cub in the distance, going about their normal bear activities. Once, the cub seemed to recognize him, pausing to look in his direction before his mother called him away. But the magical gathering never repeated, at least not when he was there to see it. Still, the forest felt different to him now. He noticed things he had never seen before. The way certain birds seemed to follow specific routes through the trees, the patterns in the moss that might have been random or might have been something more, the way animals of different species would sometimes pause and look at each other as if exchanging information. The forest was full of secrets, and even if he never witnessed another gathering, Ethan knew his life had been enriched by seeing just one. He began to research, diving into obscure texts about animal behavior, indigenous legends about the intelligence of nature, scientific papers about interspecies communication. He found hints and suggestions, stories from around the world about animals behaving in inexplicable ways, always dismissed as anthropomorphism or misinterpretation. But Ethan knew better now. He had seen the truth with his own eyes. The mother bear had been teaching the other animals something important, preparing them for that moment when the earth sang and the forest glowed. It suggested a level of intelligence and communication in the natural world that humanity had never suspected. It implied that animals weren't just reacting to their environment, but actively participating in something greater, something that connected all living things in ways science hadn't yet discovered. Ethan thought often about the cub, wondering what other lessons his mother would teach him as he grew. Would he one day lead such gatherings himself? Would he pass on this ancient knowledge to his own cubs? The thought filled Ethan with hope that regardless of human understanding or interference, this deep wisdom of the natural world would continue, passed down from generation to generation in ways people might never fully comprehend. He never did publish his photos or write that article. Instead, he kept the experience close to his heart, a secret treasure that had changed his perspective on everything. When friends commented that he seemed different, more at peace somehow, he would just smile and say he had been spending more time in nature. They had no idea how true that was, or how nature had revealed itself to be so much more than anyone imagined. Sometimes, late at night in his city apartment, Ethan would close his eyes and he could still feel it, that deep vibration from the earth, that sense of connection to something ancient and wise. He would remember the mother bear's knowing eyes, the cub's playful determination, the impossible harmony of predator and prey united in purpose. And he would smile, knowing that somewhere out there in the wilderness, the secret life of the forest continued, mysterious and magical and more beautiful than words could ever express. The experience had taught him something crucial, that humans, for all their technology and knowledge, had barely scratched the surface of understanding the natural world. There were depths to animal intelligence, complexities to ecological relationships, mysteries in the very earth itself that might take centuries to unravel, if they ever could be. The mother bear and her unusual classroom had opened a door to these mysteries, showing him that the world was far more magical than he had ever dared to believe. Months later, Ethan returned to the forest one more time. He didn't expect to see another gathering, and he didn't. But as he sat, quietly, in the clearing where it had all happened, he noticed something. A young rabbit hopped into the open space followed by a fox. Ethan tensed, expecting the inevitable chase, but instead the fox simply sat down a few feet from the rabbit. They stayed there for several minutes, the rabbit nibbling on clover, the fox watching the forest with calm eyes. Then, as if responding to some signal Ethan couldn't perceive, they both left in different directions, unhurried and unafraid. It was a small thing, barely noteworthy compared to what he had witnessed before. But it was enough to confirm that what he had seen wasn't a one-time anomaly. The forest was different, or maybe it had always been this way and humans had just never noticed. The animals knew things, understood things, participated in something greater than mere survival. The mother bear's lessons continued to ripple through the forest community in ways subtle and profound. As Ethan left the forest that day, he made a promise to himself. He would protect this secret, this magical truth about the natural world. He would continue to visit, to observe, to learn whatever the forest was willing to teach him. And maybe, if he was patient and respectful enough, he might once again witness the earth singing and the animals dancing in impossible harmony. But even if he didn't, he would carry the memory of that extraordinary morning with him always, a reminder that the world was full of wonders beyond human comprehension. The story of the mother bear teaching her unusual class would stay with him forever, not as something to be proven or explained, but as a gift to be treasured. It had shown him that intelligence and wisdom existed in forms humans had never imagined, that cooperation and communication transcended species boundaries, and that the natural world held secrets that made life infinitely more mysterious and beautiful than he had ever dreamed possible. Years passed, and Ethan became known as an exceptional nature photographer, though his best photos, the ones from that magical morning, remained in his private collection. Sometimes people would ask him what had inspired his clear love for the wilderness, what moment had defined his career. He would think of the mother bear and her cub, the glowing moss, the impossible gathering of animals, and he would simply say that he had once witnessed something in the forest that had shown him how much there was still to learn about the natural world. And late at night, when the city was quiet and he could almost imagine he heard that deep earth song again, Ethan would look through those photos and remember every detail of that morning. The mother bear's patient teaching, the cub's determined attempts to learn, the perfect cooperation of natural enemies, the forest itself coming alive with light and sound. It had been real, all of it, and it had changed him forever. He never saw the mother bear again, though he looked for her every time he returned to the forest. But sometimes he would find signs, a pattern drawn in the dirt that looked too deliberate to be random, animals of different species resting peacefully in unexpected proximity, patches of moss that seemed to glow faintly in the dawn light. The forest kept its secrets, but it also left hints for those who knew how to look. The cub would be grown now, Ethan often thought. Perhaps he had cubs of his own, and perhaps he was teaching them the same mysterious lessons his mother had taught him. Perhaps somewhere in the vast wilderness, other gatherings were taking place. Other animals were learning to transcend their natural roles and participate in something greater. The thought filled him with a deep satisfaction, knowing that regardless of human awareness or understanding, this ancient wisdom continued. Ethan's experience had fundamentally changed his understanding of intelligence and consciousness. He had seen clear evidence that animals possessed not just instinct but wisdom, not just communication but language, not just behavior but culture. The mother bear had been a teacher in the truest sense, passing on knowledge that was clearly valuable enough for prey animals to risk proximity to predators to learn. What that knowledge was, exactly, remained a mystery. The glowing moss suggested some kind of natural phenomenon that the animals had learned to anticipate and participate in. The earth song implied connections between living things that science hadn't yet discovered. The perfect cooperation between species hinted at a level of ecological integration that went far beyond simple food chains and territorial behaviors. Sometimes Ethan wondered if indigenous peoples had known about these gatherings, if their stories about talking animals and nature spirits had been based on observations similar to his own. He researched Native American legends about bears, finding numerous references to bears as teachers and wisdom keepers. Perhaps those stories hadn't been metaphorical after all. Perhaps throughout history a lucky few had witnessed what he had seen and tried to share it through story and myth. The implications were staggering. If animals could organize and communicate at this level, if they could set aside their natural antagonisms for a greater purpose, if they possessed knowledge about natural phenomena that humans didn't understand, then everything about how humanity related to the natural world needed to be reconsidered. The mother bear and her unusual students had shown that the forest was not just a collection of resources or even a complex ecosystem, but a community with its own intelligence and purpose. Ethan often thought about the moment when the mother bear had looked directly at him, that knowing gaze that had seemed to see right through his hiding spot and into his soul. She had known he was there all along. He was certain of it. She had allowed him to witness the gathering, had perhaps even wanted him to see it. But why? What purpose did it serve for one human to know this secret? Perhaps, he thought, it was meant to plant a seed of wonder, to remind at least one person that the natural world was far more than it seemed. Perhaps the bear had recognized in him someone who would treasure the knowledge rather than exploit it, who would protect the secret rather than expose it. Or perhaps it had simply been chance, a random confluence of events that had allowed him to glimpse something normally hidden from human eyes. Whatever the reason, Ethan felt honored to have been chosen, even if only by circumstance, to witness such a profound event. It had given his life meaning and direction, had filled him with a sense of purpose that went beyond career or personal ambition. He was a guardian of a secret, a keeper of wonder, a witness to the impossible. The mother bear teaching her unusual class had shown him that the world was full of teachers if only people knew how to recognize them. Every creature, from the smallest insect to the largest mammal, might possess knowledge and wisdom that humans had never suspected. The cub, learning from his mother, trying so hard to master the mysterious movements, had shown that education and culture existed throughout the animal kingdom in forms people had never imagined. As time went on, Ethan became more attuned to the subtle signs of this hidden intelligence. He noticed how certain birds would appear just before weather changes, not just sensing them but seeming to prepare other animals. He observed how predators and prey would sometimes share water sources in perfect peace, as if following rules humans didn't know existed. He saw patterns in animal movement that suggested planning and communication far beyond what science currently accepted. Each observation reinforced what he had learned that morning in the clearing, that humanity's understanding of animal intelligence was primitive at best. The mother bear had been teaching something specific and important, something that required cooperation between species that should have been enemies. The fact that they had all participated willingly, that they had understood and followed her instructions, suggested a level of interspecies communication that would revolutionize biology if it could be proven. But proof, Ethan had come to understand, might not be the point. Some things were meant to remain mysteries, to inspire wonder rather than analysis. The gathering he had witnessed was clearly something sacred to the animals, something that belonged to their world rather than the human one. His role was not to expose it, but to be changed by it, to carry that change into his own life and work. And he had been changed, profoundly and permanently. Every photograph he took now carried some essence of that morning, some hint of the deeper mysteries he had witnessed. People often commented that his images seemed to capture something beyond the physical appearance of animals, some quality of intelligence or spirit that made them more than just nature photography. If only they knew how right they were. The mother bear and her cub remained vivid in his memory, their relationship a perfect example of the complexity he had discovered. She had been patient but firm, loving but instructive, exactly like a human mother teaching an important skill to her child. The cub had been playful but eager to learn, distracted but ultimately focused when it mattered. Their interaction had been so familiar, so relatable, yet they had been participating in something completely beyond human experience. Ethan wondered what had become of them, whether they still lived in that forest, whether they still conducted their mysterious gatherings. He liked to imagine the cub, now fully grown, standing where his mother had stood, teaching a new generation of forest creatures the ancient movements, preparing them for the next time the earth would sing and the moss would glow. The continuity of it, the passing of knowledge from generation to generation, filled him with a deep sense of rightness. He had been privileged to witness one moment in an ancient cycle, a single lesson in a curriculum that might stretch back thousands of years. The mother bear had been one teacher in a long line of teachers, her cub one student among countless students, all participating in something that connected them to the earth and to each other in ways humanity had forgotten or never known. Sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light was just right, Ethan would remember the way the clearing had looked when the moss began to glow, the way the animals had moved in perfect harmony, the way the very air had seemed to shimmer with possibility. He would remember the mother bear's final look, that acknowledgement that he had been seen and, perhaps, approved of as a witness. And he would feel again that deep connection to something greater, that sense of being part of a world far more magical than most people ever realized. The secret of the forest lived on in him, not as burden, but as gift. Every time he entered the wilderness now, he did so with new eyes, aware that he was walking through a world of intelligence and purpose that operated by rules he might never fully understand. The mother bear had opened a door for him, had shown him that the boundary between human and animal intelligence was far more permeable than he had ever imagined. And so Ethan continued his work, photographing the natural world with a reverence born from true understanding. He knew that every animal he photographed might possess depths of knowledge he couldn't fathom, might participate in gatherings and rituals he would never see. The mother bear, teaching her impossible class, had taught him the most important lesson of all, that the world was full of wonders, and the greatest privilege was simply to witness them, to be changed by them, and to carry that change forward into a life lived with greater awareness and respect for the mysteries that surrounded us all. The forest kept its secrets, but it had shared one with him, and that was enough. The image of the bear cub on his mother's back, looking out at the assembled animals with wonder, stayed with him always. A reminder that learning never stopped, that teachers came in unexpected forms, and that the natural world was far more extraordinary than humanity had ever dared to dream. The mother bear's classroom might have been unusual, but the lessons learned there were universal, about cooperation, communication, and the deep connections that bind all living things together in ways that transcended human understanding. The following spring brought Ethan back to the forest with a different purpose. He had spent the winter months researching, studying every scientific paper about bioluminescence in moss, every indigenous legend about singing earth, every documented case of unusual animal cooperation. Nothing quite matched what he had witnessed, but he found enough fragments and hints to convince him that he hadn't been the first to observe such phenomena. Ancient texts spoke of times when animals gathered in council, when the forest itself came alive with light, when the boundaries between species dissolved in moments of cosmic significance. He had brought camping gear this time, determined to spend weeks if necessary to understand more about what he had seen. The forest had changed with the seasons, but the clearing remained exactly as he remembered it. The ancient oak with its hollow base stood sentinel at the edge. The same rocks and fallen logs created natural amphitheater seating, and the dirt in the center still showed faint traces of old patterns, though whether from the bear's drawing or natural weathering, he couldn't tell. Ethan set up his small tent just outside the clearing, hidden among dense ferns where he could observe without being too intrusive. He had learned from his previous experience that the forest revealed its secrets to patient observers, not active seekers. For 3 days, nothing unusual happened. Deer passed through the clearing in the early morning. Birds sang their normal songs. Squirrels chased each other through the branches in typical territorial displays. But on the 4th night, something changed. Ethan woke not to sound, but to its absence. The forest had gone completely silent. No insects chirping, no leaves rustling, no distant owl calls. He carefully emerged from his tent and made his way to his observation spot, his heart racing with anticipation. The clearing was not empty. A lone fox sat in the center, its head tilted as if listening to something beyond human hearing. As Ethan watched, the fox began to dig at a specific spot, its movements deliberate and purposeful. After creating a small depression, it sat back and waited. Within minutes, a raccoon appeared, carrying something in its nimble hands, a piece of moss that seemed to shimmer even in the darkness. The raccoon placed the moss carefully in the depression the fox had created, and both animals sat back, watching it intently. More animals began to arrive, each carrying or pushing small pieces of the same unusual moss. A team of squirrels worked together to transport a particularly large piece, while a deer used its hoof to carefully position smaller fragments around the growing pile. There was no bear this time, no obvious leader, but the animals worked with the same coordinated purpose Ethan had witnessed before. They were building something, creating a pattern with the moss that began to take on a familiar shape, similar to the drawing the mother bear had made, but more complex, more three-dimensional. As the construction continued, Ethan noticed that each piece of moss was slightly different. Some had veins of what looked like silver running through them. Others pulsed with their own faint rhythm, and still others seemed to absorb light rather than emit it. The animals were clearly selecting specific pieces for specific positions, sometimes rejecting one fragment and searching for another that met some criteria Ethan couldn't understand. A young rabbit would bring a piece forward, and an older crow would inspect it, sometimes cawing approval, sometimes shaking its head in an unmistakably negative gesture. The pattern was taking shape now, and Ethan realized with a start that it resembled a map, not of geographic features but of something else. Lines of moss connected in ways that suggested flow or movement, with nodes at intersection points that glowed slightly brighter than the connecting paths. It looked almost like a neural network, or perhaps a visualization of underground root systems, or maybe even a representation of celestial movements. The complexity was staggering, and the fact that animals of different species were creating it together defied everything he thought he knew about animal cognition. Then he noticed the young bear. Not the same cub from before. This one was older, probably 2 or 3 years old, watching from the forest edge with intense concentration. It didn't participate in the construction, just observed, occasionally making soft sounds that the other animals seemed to acknowledge with glances or small movements. Ethan wondered if this was some kind of apprenticeship, if the young bear was learning by watching just as the cub had learned from his mother. As the night progressed, the moss pattern began to respond to its arrangement. The individual pieces started to synchronize their faint pulsing, creating waves of light that traveled along the pathways the animals had created. The effect was hypnotic, like watching thoughts move through a living brain. The animals sat in a circle around their creation, their eyes reflecting the shifting patterns of light, their bodies swaying slightly in rhythm with the pulses. The young bear finally moved forward, approaching the pattern with careful steps. It reached out, with one paw, hesitating just before touching the moss, looking around at the other animals as if asking permission. The fox made a soft yipping sound, and the bear gently placed its paw on one of the glowing nodes. Immediately, the entire pattern flared brighter, and that familiar deep humming began to emanate from the earth itself. But this time, Ethan could feel that the sound was different. Younger, somehow, less deep, as if the earth was singing in a different voice. The animals began to move in response to this new song, but their dance was different from what Ethan had witnessed before. This was less formal, more exploratory. They moved in and out of the circle, sometimes alone, sometimes in pairs or small groups. A rabbit and a weasel circled each other in what should have been a predator-prey chase, but was instead an elegant duet. 3 deer moved in perfect synchronization, their steps creating a complex rhythm that complemented the earth's hum. The young bear tried to join the dance, its movements clumsy compared to the others but full of enthusiasm. When it stumbled, nearly stepping on the moss pattern, a motherly badger actually steadied it with her body, guiding it back to a safe distance. The bear looked grateful, touching noses with the badger in what was unmistakably a gesture of thanks. The interaction was so tender, so clearly communicative, that Ethan felt tears prick his eyes again. As the dance continued, the moss pattern began to change. The animal's movement seemed to be affecting it, causing certain pathways to brighten or dim, creating new connections that hadn't been there before. It was as if the dance was programming the pattern, inputting information through movement and proximity. The young bear watched this with obvious fascination, sometimes mimicking the movements of other animals even when not directly participating. Then something extraordinary happened. The moss began to project light upward, creating translucent shapes in the air above the pattern. At first, they were abstract, swirls and geometries that shifted and morphed. But gradually, they began to take on more definite forms. Ethan saw what looked like trees, but not just any trees. Specific trees from this forest, recognizable by their distinctive shapes. He saw the mountain that rose to the north, the river that wound through the valley, even what appeared to be the clearing itself, all rendered in light and floating above the moss pattern. The animals were creating a map, Ethan realized with stunning clarity. Not just drawing one, but building a 3-dimensional interactive map of their territory. As he watched, certain areas of the light map pulsed with different colors. A section of river glowed blue-green. A grove of trees emanated a warm amber. A rocky outcropping flickered with silver light. The animals made sounds of recognition, pointing with paws or wings at different features, adding their own vocalizations that caused subtle changes in the display. The young bear was transfixed, standing on its hind legs to better see the light map. It reached out tentatively, and its paw actually passed through one of the light trees, causing it to shimmer and release a sound like wind through leaves. The bear made a sound of pure wonder, looking around at the other animals as if to confirm they were seeing the same thing. A wise-looking owl hooted softly, and somehow that hoot conveyed confirmation, encouragement, and teaching all at once. As the night wore on, the light map became increasingly detailed. Ethan could see tiny points of light moving through it, and with a shock, He realized these represented actual animals in the forest. He could see a cluster of lights that must have been a deer herd bedded down for the night. A single, bright point moving along the river that was probably a beaver. Even a small constellation of lights in the trees that had to be a family of flying squirrels. The animals in the clearing were somehow tracking every living thing in their territory, creating a real-time display of the forest's inhabitants. But it was more than just tracking. The animals began to make specific sounds directed at certain points of light, and those lights would change behavior, speed up, slow down, change direction. They were communicating with animals miles away, Ethan realized, using this moss network as some kind of natural communication system. A crow caught at a cluster of lights near the eastern edge of the map, and the lights immediately began moving toward the center. Minutes later, Ethan heard actual cawing from that direction, and soon a group of crows arrived in the clearing, as if they had been summoned. The newly arrived crows brought information, their cawing causing new features to appear on the light map. A section previously dark suddenly showed a fallen tree blocking a stream. Another area sprouted tiny red lights that the animals reacted to with concern, perhaps indicating disease in the trees or some other problem. The bears, both the young one present and others represented only as lights on the map, seemed particularly interested in these red areas, their representative lights moving toward them with purpose. Ethan began to understand that he was witnessing something far beyond simple animal intelligence. This was a sophisticated information network, a way for the forest's inhabitants to share knowledge and coordinate responses to changes in their environment. The moss wasn't just bioluminescent, it was somehow connected to the living systems of the forest, able to sense and display information in ways that human technology was only beginning to explore. The young bear had moved closer to the pattern now, guided by the badger and watched carefully by all the animals. It was being taught, Ethan realized, trained in how to read and interact with this natural network. When it touched certain nodes, the badger would make approving sounds. When it reached for others, the fox would yip a warning. The bear was learning a complex language of light and sound, being initiated into an ancient system of forest communication. As dawn approached, the display began to fade, but not before showing one more remarkable thing. The light map suddenly expanded, showing not just this forest, but connecting lines extending outward to other forests, other mountains, other rivers. Ethan saw the entire landscape represented in light, with bright nodes at certain locations that pulsed in synchronization with their own. Other gatherings, he realized with awe. Other groups of animals maintaining their own moss networks, all connected in a vast web of natural communication that spanned hundreds, perhaps thousands of miles. The animals began to carefully disassemble the moss pattern, each taking back the piece they had brought, or accepting a different piece offered by another. The young bear was given a special fragment by the badger, a piece that glowed slightly brighter than the others. The bear held it carefully in its mouth, clearly understanding this was something precious, something to be protected and perhaps used to start its own network someday. As the sun rose and the animals dispersed, Ethan remained hidden, his mind reeling from what he had witnessed. The moss network was technology, but not as humans understood it. It was organic, alive, integrated completely with the natural systems of the forest. The animals weren't just using it, they were part of it, connected to it in ways that allowed them to sense and communicate across vast distances. The mother bear from his first encounter hadn't just been teaching survival skills, she had been teaching the other animals how to interface with this living network. Over the following nights, Ethan witnessed variations of this gathering. Sometimes different animals would lead, each bringing their own knowledge to share through the Moss network. An ancient turtle showed the locations of underground water sources that would remain flowing even in drought. A mother fox demonstrated how certain paths through the territory changed with the seasons, some becoming impassable in winter, others only safe during specific weather conditions. Each session added layers to the collective knowledge, stored somehow in the moss itself and accessible to any animal that knew how to read it. The young bear became a regular participant, gradually learning not just to read the network, but to contribute to it. Ethan watched it add its own discoveries. A new beehive, a particularly productive berry patch, a dangerous area where the ground was unstable. The other animals would verify this information, sometimes sending scouts to confirm before adding it permanently to the network's knowledge base. It was peer review, scientific verification, conducted entirely by creatures humans considered incapable of such abstract thinking. One night, during a particularly complex session where the animals were tracking what appeared to be weather patterns, the unexpected happened. The Moss network suddenly flared with urgent red light, and all the animals turned toward the eastern edge of the forest. The light map showed something moving fast through the territory, not an animal, but something else. The creatures in the clearing became agitated, not fearful, but clearly concerned. The young bear stood on its hind legs, peering into the darkness, a low rumble in its throat. Then Ethan heard it, the distant sound of machinery. Loggers, he realized with a sinking heart. They were coming to harvest this section of forest. The animals had detected them through their network long before human senses could have perceived the threat. But what amazed Ethan was what happened next. Instead of fleeing, the animals began what could only be described as strategic planning. Using the light map, they identified which animals were in the path of the approaching machinery. The crows were dispatched as messengers, their cawing creating ripples of activity across the projected forest. The deer began marking safe routes for smaller animals to evacuate. The bear used its paw to indicate cave systems where creatures could take shelter. It wasn't panic. It was organized, coordinated evacuation planning that would have impressed any emergency management professional. But they did more than just plan evacuation. The fox and raccoon began discussing something intensely, their chittering and yipping causing certain areas of the map to highlight. They were identifying what Ethan slowly realized were human trails and observation points, places where the logging activity would be most visible to any humans who might intervene. The animals were actually strategizing how to attract human attention to the logging, understanding that sometimes humans would stop other humans from destroying the forest. The young bear contributed its own idea, touching a part of the map that showed a nearby ranger station. The other animals considered this, and the owl hooted what seemed to be approval. Within minutes, a coordinated plan emerged. Certain animals would create disturbances near the ranger station, not dangerous ones, but enough to draw attention. Others would leave obvious signs of their presence along hiking trails where morning joggers would find them. They were manipulating human behavior, using their understanding of human patterns to protect their territory. As dawn broke and the logging sounds grew closer, the animals dispersed to implement their plan. The young bear carefully buried its piece of special moss at the base of the ancient oak, marking the spot with subtle scratches that Ethan realized were not random, but some form of writing or notation. Then it headed toward the ranger station, purpose in every step. The other animals spread out through the forest, each with a specific role in their protection strategy. Ethan faced a dilemma. He could document the logging, threat, raise the alarm himself. But that would mean revealing how he knew, potentially exposing the secret of the Moss network. As he wrestled with this decision, he noticed something. A crow had landed near his hiding spot and was looking directly at him. It cawed once, softly, then flew to a nearby tree where it had deposited something. His car keys, which must have fallen from his pocket sometime during the night. The message was clear. The animals knew he was there, had known all along, and were giving him a role in their plan. He understood. He was to be their human voice, but in a way that wouldn't reveal their secret. He could report the illegal logging he had stumbled upon while photographing. He could alert authorities to the presence of endangered species in the area. After all, he had photographs of bears and other protected animals. He could be part of their network without exposing it, playing his role just as each animal played theirs. As Ethan made his way back to his car to call the authorities, he passed the young bear heading toward the ranger station. Their eyes met for a moment, and the bear paused. It made a soft sound, almost like a greeting, and Ethan found himself responding with a gentle, "Good luck," that he knew the bear couldn't understand in words but might comprehend in intent. The bear continued on its way, and Ethan realized he had just participated in the interspecies communication network he had been observing. The authorities arrived within hours, alerted by multiple reports. Ethan's call about illegal logging, rangers reporting unusual animal behavior that suggested disturbance in the forest, hikers finding clear evidence of recent bear activity in areas scheduled for cutting. The logging was stopped, at least temporarily, while investigations were conducted. The animals' plan had worked, their understanding of human bureaucracy and behavior proving remarkably accurate. That night, Ethan returned to the clearing to find a celebration of sorts taking place. The moss network was active, but showing different patterns. Swirling, dancing lights that seemed purely aesthetic rather than informational. The animals were playing in the light, jumping through the projections, creating shadow patterns that made the others chirp or grunt in what sounded like laughter. The young bear was in the center, standing on its hind legs and waving its paws through the light streams, creating patterns that the other animals seemed to find delightful. It was then that Ethan noticed something that took his breath away. The moss was responding not just to the animals but to him. Where he stood, just outside the clearing, thin tendrils of light were reaching toward him, pulsing gently as if an invitation. He stepped forward carefully, and the light followed, creating a faint path from his position to the edge of the animal circle. The creatures turned to look at him, but there was no alarm, no aggression. The fox yipped once, a sound that seemed welcoming, and space was made in the circle. Ethan found himself sitting among the animals, surrounded by the dancing lights of the moss network. He couldn't interact with it the way they could. He lacked whatever biological interface they possessed, but he could feel it somehow, a tingling awareness of connection that went beyond his normal senses. The young bear ambled over and sat beside him, its warm bulk comforting rather than threatening. Together, they watched the lights dance, two different species united in wonder at the mystery they were witnessing. As the night progressed, Ethan began to understand more about the moss network. It wasn't just in this forest. It was everywhere, in various forms. The specific bioluminescent moss was rare, yes, but it was just one manifestation of a much larger phenomenon. The mycelial networks that connected trees, the pheromone trails of insects, the infrasonic communications of elephants, the magnetic field navigation of birds, they were all part of the same vast, interconnected system of natural communication that existed parallel to but separate from human technology. The animals had evolved to tap into this network in ways humans had lost or never developed. They could sense the health of trees through fungal networks, feel the approach of storms through electromagnetic changes, communicate across species barriers using frequencies and chemicals humans couldn't perceive. The moss gatherings were just the most visible manifestation of this communication, a kind of internet cafe where different species could come together to share information more directly. The young bear had become something like a system administrator for this local network, learning from the older animals how to maintain and interpret the moss patterns. Ethan watched it work with different species, each teaching their specialized knowledge. The beavers showed how water flow information was encoded. The birds demonstrated how air current data appeared in the network. The underground creatures explained the patterns that indicated soil health and stability. It was a university of the forest, with professors from every species and a curriculum that spanned every aspect of survival and thriving in the wild. But it went beyond survival. Ethan observed sessions that could only be described as artistic. Animals would create patterns in the moss purely for their beauty, compositions of light that served no practical purpose except to be appreciated. They would tell stories through the network, abstract representations of events that others would watch with rapt attention. A old raccoon created a light pattern that showed the history of the clearing, how it had changed over many seasons, and the other animals added their own memories to the display, creating a collective historical record. The young bear proved particularly talented at these artistic displays. It would create patterns that made the other animals react, with obvious pleasure, spirals of light that mimicked the northern lights they could sometimes see through the canopy, representations of flowers that wouldn't bloom for months yet, even what appeared to be portraits of other animals rendered in flowing light. It was using the network not just for communication, but for expression, for creativity, for art. One night, the bear created a pattern that Ethan recognized with a shock. It was him, a light representation of a human figure holding what was clearly meant to be a camera. The other animals studied this with interest, and some began adding to it, creating a larger scene that showed Ethan in various positions around the forest, always watching, always photographing. They had been aware of him for longer than he had realized, had incorporated his presence into their understanding of the territory. He wasn't an intruder. He was part of the ecosystem they were mapping. This realization led to an even more profound understanding. The animals weren't just using the network to communicate with each other. They were documenting their world, creating a living library of forest knowledge that could be passed down through generations. The moss patterns weren't temporary. They left traces, chemical and electromagnetic signatures that could be read long after the visible light had faded. Each gathering added to this accumulated wisdom, building a database that stretched back who knew how long. Ethan thought about the indigenous peoples who had lived in these forests for thousands of years, and wondered if they had known about the network. Their stories about talking animals and living forests suddenly seemed less like mythology and more like observations of a real phenomenon. Perhaps they had even found ways to interface with it, to become part of the natural communication system in ways modern humans had forgotten. The young bear seemed to sense his thoughts, turning to look at him with those intelligent eyes. It reached out with one paw, not touching him but indicating the moss pattern. Then it did something remarkable. It created a simple pattern in the light and looked at Ethan expectantly. It was trying to teach him, just as its mother had taught the other animals. The pattern was basic, just 3 lights in a triangle. But the bear waited patiently for Ethan to respond. Ethan looked around at the other animals, all watching with interest. He couldn't manipulate the moss directly, but perhaps he picked up a stick and drew the same triangle in the dirt beside the moss pattern. The bear made a sound of approval, and the other animals chittered and chirped in what seemed like encouragement. The bear created a new pattern, a square this time, and again waited. Ethan drew it in the dirt, and the bear's approval was even more enthusiastic. This continued for some time. the bear creating increasingly complex patterns, and Ethan reproducing them in dirt or with arrangements of stones and sticks. The other animals began participating, adding their own elements to the patterns, creating a collaborative artwork that bridged the gap between species. It was a language lesson, Ethan realized, but also something more. It was an invitation into their community, an acknowledgement that he could be part of their network even if he couldn't directly interface with it. As the weeks passed, Ethan became a regular participant in the gatherings. He learned to read the basic patterns of the moss network, understanding when it indicated weather changes, animal movements, or forest health issues. He couldn't contribute directly to the light displays, but he found other ways to participate. He would bring information from the human world, showing through drawings when hunting season would begin, where new trails were being planned, when controlled burns were scheduled. The animals would incorporate this information into their network, using it to plan their own activities. The young bear became his primary teacher and companion in these sessions. It had developed a special talent for translating between the moss network and methods Ethan could understand. It would create a pattern in light, then help Ethan recreate it in physical materials, patiently correcting his mistakes and celebrating his successes. Their relationship was unlike anything Ethan had ever experienced. Not pet and owner, not even friends in the human sense, but colleagues in the great work of understanding and protecting the forest. One evening, as spring turned toward summer, the gatherings took on a different character. The animals were preparing for something, their movements more formal, more ritualistic than usual. The moss network showed patterns Ethan had never seen before, complex mandalas of light that seemed to represent not just physical space but time, showing cycles and seasons stretching back years. The young bear was particularly focused, practicing specific movements over and over, perfecting something that would clearly be important. Then Ethan understood. This was a graduation of sorts. The young bear had completed its training, had learned all the local network could teach it. It was time for it to establish its own territory, to start its own node in the greater network. The other animals had gathered to witness this transition, to formally acknowledge the bear's new status as a keeper of forest knowledge. The ceremony, for that's what it was, began at moonrise. The bear stood in the center of the moss pattern, which glowed brighter than Ethan had ever seen it. Each animal approached in turn, touching noses with the bear, or making their species-specific gesture of respect. The badger, who had been its primary teacher, brought forward a special piece of moss, different from the others, darker but with veins of brilliant blue running through it. This was the seed for a new network node, Ethan realized, the beginning of what would become another gathering place. The bear accepted the moss with great solemnity, holding it carefully in its mouth. Then it began to dance, not the clumsy movements of its youth, but something graceful and powerful. A dance that told the story of its education, its growth, its readiness to take on the responsibility of maintaining the forest network. The other animals watched in respectful silence, and Ethan found himself deeply moved by the dignity and importance of the moment. When the dance was complete, the bear approached each member of the gathering, exchanging what could only be described as farewells. When it came to Ethan, it paused, then did something unprecedented. It set down the precious moss and stood on its hind legs, reaching out to place its paws gently on Ethan's shoulders. They stood there for a moment, two species bridging an impossible gap, acknowledging each other as fellow guardians of something precious and irreplaceable. Then the bear picked up its moss, looked once more around the clearing, and walked into the forest. The other animals began to disperse, but slowly, reluctantly, as if not quite ready for the gathering to end. The moss network gradually dimmed, returning to its dormant state, but Ethan could still feel its presence, the potential for communication and connection that it represented. In the days that followed, Ethan would sometimes see signs of the young bear's work in a valley several miles away. New moss patterns appeared there, simple at first but growing in complexity. Other animals began to gather at the new node, and Ethan knew the network was expanding, the ancient system of forest communication gaining a new voice, a new perspective. He continued to visit the original clearing, where new young animals were beginning their education. Another bear cub, foxes, a young bobcat, all learning to interface with the network, to contribute to and draw from the accumulated wisdom of the forest. The badger who had taught the young bear had become the primary instructor, patient and thorough in passing on knowledge that stretched back generations. One night, as Ethan sat at the edge of a gathering, watching the familiar dance of light and life, he realized something profound. The network wasn't separate from nature. It was nature, the visible manifestation of the interconnectedness that had always existed. Every living thing was part of it in some way, contributing information, receiving wisdom, participating in the grand conversation of life. Humans had simply forgotten how to listen, how to see the patterns that connected all things. But perhaps that was changing. Ethan thought about the growing understanding of mycelial networks, the recognition of plant communication, the acceptance that animals possessed consciousness and culture. Maybe humanity was slowly rediscovering what it had lost, learning again to perceive the natural internet that had existed long before the digital one. The young bear and its fellow creatures were the teachers, patient and persistent, waiting for humans to remember they were part of the same network. As summer reached its peak, Ethan made a decision. He would document what he had learned, but carefully, respectfully. Not the sensational revelation of talking animals and glowing moss, but something subtler, photographs and writings that hinted at the deeper intelligence of nature, that suggested connections and communications beyond current scientific understanding. He would plant seeds of wonder, just as the young bear had planted its moss in a new valley, trusting that understanding would grow in its own time. The last time Ethan saw the young bear, it had returned to the original clearing for what appeared to be a conference of network administrators. Several bears of different ages had gathered, along with the most knowledgeable members of other species. They were sharing information across territories, updating the greater network with local changes, planning for challenges that affected the entire forest system. The young bear had grown into its role, confident and competent, a full participant in the ancient work of maintaining the forest's living library. They acknowledged each other across the clearing, the bear with a gentle rumble, Ethan with a nod and a smile. They had come so far from that first encounter when Ethan had hidden in the bushes, afraid to disturb what he was witnessing. Now he was part of it. Not fully integrated like the forest creatures, but connected nonetheless. A bridge between two worlds that weren't as separate as most believed. The moss network pulsed with life that night, showing connections that stretched beyond the forest to other ecosystems, other gatherings, other species maintaining their own nodes in the global web of natural communication. Ethan saw deserts where coyotes and rabbits shared information about water sources, oceans where dolphins and whales coordinated their movements across vast distances, cities where rats and pigeons had adapted the ancient network to urban environments. Life was talking to itself everywhere, in languages older than words, using technologies more elegant than anything humans had invented. As he prepared to leave the forest after months of observation, Ethan felt changed at a fundamental level. He had witnessed something that challenged everything modern civilization believed about intelligence, communication, and consciousness. The mother bear teaching her impossible class had been just the beginning. The first glimpse of a reality where every living thing was part of a vast, communicating whole. He thought about the young bear, now not so young, maintaining its section of the network, teaching new generations, adding to the accumulated wisdom of the forest. He thought about the moss, glowing with bioluminescent beauty while performing functions that human science was only beginning to understand. He thought about the animals, each species contributing its unique perspective to the collective knowledge, predator and prey united in the greater work of survival and thriving. The implications were staggering. If animals could communicate and cooperate at this level, if they could maintain information networks and pass down cultural knowledge, if they could create art and conduct ceremonies and make collective decisions, then everything about how humanity related to nature needed to be reconsidered. The young bear and its network showed that humans weren't the only intelligent species on Earth. They were just one voice in a vast chorus, and they had forgotten how to sing along. But there was hope. The fact that Ethan had been accepted into the gatherings, that the animals had tried to teach him their visual language, that they had incorporated human activity into their network planning. All of this suggested that reconnection was possible. The bridge between human and natural intelligence hadn't been burned, just neglected. It could be rebuilt, one observer, one interaction, one moment of recognition at a time. As Ethan drove away from the forest for the last time, his equipment packed with thousands of photos and notebooks full of observations, he carried with him more than documentation. He carried a new understanding of what the world could be if humans remembered they were part of nature's network, not separate from it. The young bear had shown him that teaching and learning happened everywhere in nature, that wisdom was accumulated and shared across species boundaries, that the forest itself was alive with intelligence and purpose. The story would continue without him. New animals would learn to read the moss patterns. New nodes would be established. New connections would be made. The network would adapt to changing conditions, incorporating new challenges and opportunities into its vast database. The bears would continue their teaching, the moss would continue its glowing, and the earth would continue its deep, harmonious singing that only some could hear, but all could feel. Ethan's role now was to be a translator, to find ways to share what he had learned without betraying the trust the animals had shown him. He would speak in metaphors and images, in suggestions and wonder, planting seeds of understanding that might one day bloom into recognition of the intelligence that surrounded humanity on all sides. The young bear had graduated from student to teacher, and now it was Ethan's turn to do the same. The photographs he would share would show animals in moments of obvious intelligence and communication. The writings would hint at connections and cooperations that challenged conventional wisdom. He would tell stories that sounded like fiction but carried the truth of what he had witnessed. And maybe, just maybe, others would begin to look more closely at the natural world, to see the patterns and connections that had always been there, waiting to be recognized. The mother bear's classroom had expanded beyond that, first clearing to encompass the entire forest, and the young bear had become a professor in its own right. The lessons continued, the network grew, and the ancient wisdom of the natural world flowed through channels that humanity was only beginning to perceive. Ethan had been privileged to witness this hidden life of the forest, to see behind the veil that separated human perception from natural reality. As he returned to his life in the city, Ethan found himself noticing things he had never seen before. The way pigeons gathered in specific locations at specific times, as if following some invisible schedule. The patterns that ants created on sidewalks that looked random but might encode information. The trees in parks that seemed healthier when planted in certain arrangements, as if they too were part of some communication network. The natural internet was everywhere, even in the most urban environments, maintained by creatures humans barely noticed. He thought often of the young bear, wondering what new knowledge it was adding to the network, what problems it was solving, what beauty it was creating in those light patterns only forest creatures could fully appreciate. He imagined it teaching its own cubs one day, passing on not just survival skills but the deep wisdom of interconnection, the understanding that every living thing was part of something greater. The experience had taught Ethan that intelligence wasn't just about individual consciousness, but about collective awareness, shared knowledge, and communal wisdom. The forest network showed that evolution had produced not just smart individual animals, but smart ecosystems, intelligent communities that could respond to challenges and opportunities in coordinated ways. The young bear wasn't just a smart bear, it was a node in a vast intelligence that encompassed the entire forest and beyond. This understanding changed how Ethan saw everything. Every ant colony became a distributed intelligence, every flock of birds a thinking system, every forest a conscious entity. The boundaries between individual and collective, between one species and another, between living and non-living, became fluid and permeable. The moss network had shown him that these boundaries were human constructs, not natural laws. He began giving talks at nature centers and universities, carefully presenting his observations in ways that expanded thinking without seeming impossible. He spoke about the proven intelligence of animals, the documented communication between trees, the observable cooperation between species. He showed his photographs, letting the images speak to something deeper than words could convey. And slowly, he saw understanding dawn in some faces, the recognition that nature was far more than humanity had assumed. Sometimes, late at night in his urban apartment, Ethan would close his eyes and he could almost feel it. The pulse of the network, the flow of information through natural channels, the deep communication happening all around him, even in the city. He knew that somewhere, the young bear was adding new data to the system. Other animals were learning to read the patterns, and the moss was glowing with the accumulated wisdom of centuries. The story had no ending because it was still being written, not in words, but in light and sound and chemical signals, in the daily interactions of countless creatures all participating in the same grand conversation. The mother bear's lesson to her impossible class had been just one sentence in an epic that had been going on since life began and would continue as long as life existed. The young bear was now writing its own chapter, and Ethan had been privileged to read a few pages of this great book of nature. Years would pass, and Ethan would continue his work, building bridges between human and natural intelligence, helping others see what he had been shown. He would never forget the young bear, the glowing moss, the impossible gatherings where predator and prey set aside their roles to participate in something greater. These memories would guide his work, inspire his art, and remind him always that the world was far more magical than most people dared to believe. And somewhere in a forest clearing, the moss would glow, animals would gather, and the ancient work of maintaining nature's network would continue. New bears would learn from patient teachers, new patterns would be added to the collective knowledge, and the earth would sing its deep song for those who knew how to listen. The connection between all living things would pulse with information and wisdom, waiting for humanity to remember it was part of this network, had always been part of it, and could be again if it chose to listen, to learn, and to participate in the great conversation of life. The young bear had shown that learning never stopped, that every creature had something to teach and something to learn, that wisdom was not the property of any one species, but the inheritance of all life. Its journey from playful cub to network administrator was a reminder that growth and understanding were possible for any being willing to pay attention, to practice, and to connect with others across the boundaries that seemed to divide but actually united all living things. In the end, the story of the mother bear teaching her impossible class, of the young bear learning to read the Moss Network, of Ethan discovering the hidden intelligence of nature, was really the story of connection. How all things were connected, had always been connected, and how recognizing this connection changed everything. It was a story that would continue as long as there were forests to glow with mysterious light, animals to gather in impossible harmony, and humans brave enough to witness and believe in the magic that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. The forest kept its secrets but shared them with those who approached with respect and wonder. The young bear had become a keeper of these secrets, a guardian of ancient wisdom, a teacher for future generations. And Ethan had become something similar in the human world, a keeper of wonder, a guardian of mystery, a teacher who helped others see that the natural world was not just alive but aware, not just surviving but thriving with intelligence and purpose beyond human comprehension. The Moss Network pulsed on, connecting forest to forest, ecosystem to ecosystem, life to life in an endless web of communication and consciousness. The young bear added its voice to this great conversation, and through Ethan's work, perhaps humanity would learn to add its voice too, to sing along with the Earth's ancient song, to participate in the intelligence that surrounded and included them, whether they knew it or not.